My name is Lillian, and for 30 years, I lived what I thought was a perfect life. Our big house just outside the city limits was my haven, a place where happiness seemed to bloom endlessly. My husband, Tom, was my rock. Our son, Jake, was the light of our lives, a budding football star at his college. I remember the day Jake brought home Sarah, his girlfriend. She was a sweet girl with a gentle smile and kind eyes. I took to her immediately, seeing in her the daughter I never had. They'd come over often, filling our house with youthful laughter and dreams of the future. As I watched them, I couldn't help but think about wedding bells and their future. They seemed so perfect together, so in sync. I'd already started thinking of Sarah as part of our family. As the days passed, I noticed Jake becoming increasingly excited about something. He'd burst into the house after practice, practically vibrating with energy. At first, I chalked it up to his passion for football and his relationship with Sarah. But there was something different about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Jake bounded into the kitchen, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Mom, guess what? I'm going to a competition in the neighboring state." I turned from the stove, smiling at his excitement. "That's wonderful, honey. When is it?" "We leave next week," he replied, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "It's a big deal, Mom. Could be a real game changer for my career." Something about his demeanor struck me as odd. Jake had been to many competitions before, but he'd never been quite this keyed up about one. "Are you okay, Jake?" I asked, studying his face. "You seem different." He waved off my concern with a laugh. "I'm fine, Mom. Better than fine. You don't need to worry about me. This is just a really important opportunity, that's all." I nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to let it go. "All right, sweetie. Just remember, you can always talk to me if something's on your mind." 3 long months passed, and Jake was still gone. At first, I wasn't too concerned. These competitions could sometimes run longer than expected, especially if the team was doing well. I called him regularly, and each time, he assured me everything was fine. "The competition's just lasting longer than we thought, Mom," he'd say. "Don't worry about me." I believed him. After all, Jake had never lied to me before. Why would he start now? Still, as the weeks dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. One evening, as Tom and I sat on the porch, I voiced my concerns. "Don't you think it's odd that Jake's been gone so long?" Tom sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "It is unusual, but if he says everything's okay, we should trust him. He's a grown man now, Lil." Finally, after 3 months, Jake returned. But the bombshell he dropped on us was nothing I could have prepared for. "Mom, Dad," he announced one evening, "I've decided I want to live separately. I'm going to rent an apartment." I exchanged a surprised look with Tom. This was unexpected, but not entirely unreasonable. Jake was an adult, after all. "If that's what you want, son," Tom said, "we support your decision." I nodded in agreement, albeit with a hint of sadness. Our baby was really growing up. "Just know you're always welcome here, Jake." Over the next few weeks, Jake rarely visited. Instead, he'd send messages, often asking for money. Each time, I'd transfer the funds, hoping it would help him become more independent. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something had changed in our relationship. Then came the phone call that would turn our world upside down. "Mom," Jake's voice crackled over the line, "I'm coming over tonight. I've got some important news to share. And I won't be alone." My heart leaped with excitement. Could it be? Were Jake and Sarah finally taking the next step? "That's wonderful, honey," I exclaimed. "I'll cook up a special dinner for us all." As I hung up the phone, I turned to Tom with a wide grin. "I think our boy's finally going to make it official with Sarah." Tom chuckled, pulling me into a hug. "Well, it's about time. They make a great couple." I spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity, preparing Jake's favorite dishes, and setting the table with our best china. This was a momentous occasion, and I wanted everything to be perfect. As evening fell, I heard a car pull up in the driveway. My heart raced with anticipation as I smoothed down my dress and went to open the door. But the sight that greeted me was nothing like what I had expected. Jake stood there, all right, but the woman by his side wasn't Sarah. This girl was a stranger, strikingly beautiful, dressed in bright, provocative clothing that seemed out of place for a family dinner. "Mom," Jake said, his voice oddly flat, "I'd like you to meet Veronica, my wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of cruel joke. But the defiant look in Jake's eyes and the smug smile on Veronica's face told me it was all too real. We all moved to the dining room in a daze. As we sat down at the table I'd so carefully prepared, I couldn't stop staring at Veronica. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something cold in her eyes that made me uneasy. Jake, seeming oblivious to the tension, launched into a description of their wedding. "We had an amazing ceremony at that new upscale venue downtown. You should have seen it, Mom. The flowers, the music, everything was perfect." Each word felt like a knife twisting in my heart. "How could you celebrate your wedding without the people closest to you?" I asked, fighting back tears. Jake's face hardened. "The closest person to me is my wife," he declared. "I want to make her happy." Veronica raised her head, a smug smile playing on her lips. Jake continued, his voice softening slightly. "Veronica's parents abandoned her years ago. Her grandmother raised her, but she passed away recently. I didn't want Veronica to feel lonely at our wedding, so we decided not to invite any relatives. We celebrated with just our friends." I sat there, trying to process this information. Then a thought struck me. "Jake, what about Sarah? What happened with her?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I left her," he mumbled. She cheated on me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sweet, kind Sarah, cheating? It didn't make any sense. Trying to understand more about this woman who had suddenly become part of our family, I turned to Veronica. "So, Veronica," I began, attempting to keep my voice steady, "where are you from originally?" Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained silent. Undeterred, I pressed on. "What do you do for a living? Are you working somewhere at the moment?" Again, Veronica avoided answering, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps you could tell us a bit about your interests? What do you like to do in your free time?" I tried once more, desperation creeping into my voice. At this, Veronica abruptly stood up. "I'm not obliged to discuss my personal life with outsiders," she announced haughtily. "We're leaving." Without so much as a thank you for the dinner, she strode towards the door. Jake jumped up to follow her, pausing only to ask me to pack some food for them and transfer money for their honeymoon. As the door slammed behind them, Tom and I sat in stunned silence. The next day, still reeling from the previous night's events, I decided to call Jake. I needed answers, needed to understand what was going on. But when the call connected, it wasn't Jake's voice I heard. "Jake's busy right now," Veronica's cold voice came through the speaker. "He can't talk. But you can send money for our honeymoon to his card. We have nothing else to discuss with you." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, shock giving way to a deep, aching sadness. What had happened to my sweet boy? And how had this woman gained such control over him? With a heavy heart, I transferred several $1,000s to Jake's account. It was all I could do, the only way I could still feel connected to my son. Weeks passed, and life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Tom and I tried to come to terms with Jake's sudden marriage, but the silence from our son was deafening. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was Jake. "Mom," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "I've got amazing news. Veronica's pregnant. We're going to have a baby." My heart leaped. A grandchild. Despite everything, joy surged through me. "Oh, Jake, that's wonderful news. Yeah, it's great, he continued, his tone shifting slightly. But, we need some help. Preparing for a baby is expensive, you know? I transferred a substantial amount to Jake's account, my heart full of hope. Maybe this baby would bring our family back together. A few weeks later, I was tidying up the living room when I heard a car pull up. To my surprise, Jake and Veronica burst through the front door without knocking. Veronica strode past me, her eyes scanning every corner of our home. "This house will do nicely," she declared, her tone matter of fact. "I'm sorry, what?" I stammered, confused. Jake stepped forward, his face set in determination. "Mom, we've decided that we're going to live here. You and Dad need to find somewhere else to stay." I felt as if I'd been slapped. "What are you talking about? This is our home." Veronica turned to me, her eyes cold. "For the proper development of our child, we need freedom and space. This house is perfect." Anger bubbled up inside me. "Absolutely not. This is our home, and you can't just demand we leave." Veronica's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Fine. But you can forget about having any relationship with your son or your future grandchild." Before I could respond, they turned and stormed out, leaving me standing in shock. From that day on, my phone was flooded with messages from Jake. Each one demanded we give them the house, each one more insulting and threatening than the last. I couldn't believe the cruel words coming from my son. What had happened to him? 2 weeks of this torment passed, before Jake showed up at our door again. His face was contorted with rage. "You need to give us this house," he shouted. "Veronica's threatening to divorce me if you don't. Do you want to ruin my marriage?" I tried to reason with him. "Jake, honey, can't you see? She's blackmailing you. This isn't right." His face turned an alarming shade of red. "Don't you dare talk about Veronica like that. You're not worth a hair on her head." That was the final straw for Tom. Without a word, he grabbed Jake by the arm and forcefully escorted him out the door, slamming it behind him. As Jake's angry shouts faded, I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. Tom knelt beside me, wrapping his arms around me. Weeks passed, and life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Tom and I tried to process the drastic changes in our son's behavior, but the pain and confusion lingered. One day, while shopping for groceries, I heard a familiar voice call out my name. "Lillian?" I turned to see Sarah, Jake's ex-fiancée, standing by the produce section. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed her heavily pregnant belly. Memories of Jake's accusations about her cheating flooded back, and I found myself at a loss for words. Gathering my composure, I managed to smile. "Sarah, I had no idea you were expecting. How are you feeling?" Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. It's not easy," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Being pregnant and abandoned, it's been tough." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. Abandoned? That didn't align with Jake's story at all. Sensing there was more to this situation, I gently probed for details. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me what happened?" "Jake told us, well, he said you had cheated on him." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Cheated? Lillian, no. That's not what happened at all." Over the next half hour, as we stood in the quiet corner of the grocery store, Sarah revealed the truth that shattered my world. "Jake didn't go to any sports competition," she explained, her voice trembling. "He met a girl online and went to meet her in another state. He was gone for 3 months, remember?" I nodded, the pieces starting to fall into place. Sarah continued. "When I found out I was pregnant, I called Jake to tell him the news. But he told me he had married someone else. He refused to have anything to do with the baby." My legs felt weak. I leaned against the shopping cart for support, trying to process this information. Our Jake, our sweet boy, had lied to us all. He had abandoned Sarah and their unborn child for a woman he barely knew. We parted ways with promises to stay in touch, and I headed home in a daze. My mind was reeling from the revelations. Jake's story about the extended competition, his sudden marriage to Veronica, his cruel treatment of us, it all made a twisted kind of sense now. As I walked through our front door, Tom took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Lil, what happened?" he asked, concern etched on his features. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "Tom, sit down," I said. "There's something you need to know about Jake." As I recounted my conversation with Sarah, I watched the color drain from Tom's face. Our son had lied to us, abandoned his pregnant fiancée, and married a virtual stranger. In the days following my encounter with Sarah, Tom and I had many long, difficult conversations. We both felt a deep sense of responsibility towards Sarah and her unborn child, our grandchild. "We need to help her, Tom," I said one evening. "She shouldn't have to go through this alone." Tom nodded in agreement. "You're right. Let's reach out to her." When we approached Sarah with our offer of support, she initially refused, her pride and hurt evident in her eyes. But as the weeks passed and we gently persisted, she eventually accepted our help. I began to see her often, accompanying her to doctor's appointments, helping her prepare for the baby's arrival, and simply being there as a shoulder to cry on. One evening, as I returned home from helping Sarah set up the nursery, Tom met me with a serious expression. "Lil, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice grave. "I hired a private detective." I stared at him in shock. "You did what?" Tom sighed heavily. "I needed to know what was really going on with Jake. The detective's report came in today, and Lil, it's worse than we thought." Over the next hour, Tom revealed the detective's findings. Jake had dropped out of college, abandoning his sports career and education to get a job supporting Veronica's extravagant spending habits. The detective had overheard a conversation between Jake and Veronica, where they coldly discussed plans to force us out of our home and claim it for themselves. But the most shocking revelation was about Veronica's past. She had a history of pursuing wealthy men for their money. The detective discovered that Veronica had become pregnant by one of these men and had manipulated Jake into marriage by claiming the child was his. I stood up, my mind racing. "We have to tell Jake. We have to make him see what's happening." But Tom shook his head sadly. "Lil, he won't believe us. You've seen how he is now. If we try to tell him, he'll only push us further away." As much as it pained me, I knew Tom was right. Jake was so under Veronica's influence that any attempt to reveal the truth would likely backfire. "What do we do, then?" I asked, feeling helpless. Tom took my hand in his. "For now, we focus on Sarah and the baby. They're the ones who truly need us right now." I nodded, fighting back tears. "You're right. Sarah needs us, and that baby, our grandchild, they're innocent in all of this." As we sat there, processing all we had learned, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger, sadness, and fear for Jake. But I also felt a renewed sense of purpose. We might not be able to help Jake right now, but we could be there for Sarah and her baby. And maybe, just maybe, by showing Jake what real love and support looked like, we could eventually break through to him. Just when Tom and I thought things couldn't get any worse, we woke up one morning to find our house defaced with cruel, insulting graffiti. Greedy oldsters, selfish bastards, and other hurtful words were spray-painted across our walls in angry red letters. Shocked and hurt, we immediately called our neighbor across the street, who had outdoor security cameras. We watched the footage with heavy hearts, witnessing our own son vandalizing our home in the dead of night. The sight of Jake, sneaking around like a common criminal, left us speechless. We didn't confront Jake about the graffiti. Instead, we quietly painted over the hateful words and put our house on the market. Within weeks, we had sold our longtime home and purchased a new one, not far from where Sarah lived with her newborn son, our grandson. The day Sarah brought little Thomas home from the hospital was bittersweet. As I held that tiny bundle in my arms, my heart swelled with love and broke simultaneously. This was my grandson, Jake's son, yet Jake wanted nothing to do with him. Weeks passed, and we settled into our new life. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was Jake, calling from an unfamiliar number. "Mom," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "What the hell is going on?" I went to the house and there are strangers living there. They threatened to call the cops on me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Why did you go there, Jake? To vandalize our home again?" There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. "That's right," I continued, my voice steady. "We know it was you. We sold the house, Jake. And we've cut you out of our lives." Jake's shock quickly turned to anger. "You can't do this to me," he yelled. "Veronica might leave me because of you. I'll never see my son." I couldn't help but laugh, a sad, hollow sound. "Oh, Jake. That child isn't yours. Veronica lied to you." "What are you talking about?" he sputtered. "We hired a private investigator, Jake. We know everything. About Veronica's past, about her lying about your paternity, about your plans to take our house. I'm sending you the evidence now." As I hit send on the email containing the detective's report, I heard Jake's sharp intake of breath. "You're a fool, Jake," I said, my voice softening slightly. "You abandoned Sarah and your real son for a woman who's been lying to you from the start. I hope one day you'll realize what you've thrown away." With that, I hung up the phone, my hand shaking slightly. 6 months passed in a blur of baby giggles, sleepless nights, and newfound joy. Tom and I had settled into our roles as doting grandparents, cherishing every moment with little Thomas. Our new home, though smaller, was filled with more love and laughter than we'd experienced in years. One sunny afternoon, as we sat on our porch watching Sarah push Thomas on the swing we'd installed in the backyard, our neighbor walked by with some surprising news. "Did you hear about Jake?" she asked, her voice low. "Word is, that wife of his up and left him. Apparently, she handed their child over to her parents, turns out she wasn't an orphan after all, and ran off with some wealthy man she met." Tom and I exchanged glances, a mix of emotions washing over us. Despite everything, a part of me still ached for the pain Jake must be going through. Later that evening, as if summoned by our thoughts, Jake called. His voice was a far cry from the angry, demanding tone we'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he sounded broken, desperate. "Mom," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. For everything. Please, can we start over? I know I'm still your sole heir. I can change, I promise." I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar ache in my chest. "Oh, Jake," I said softly. "I'm sorry you're hurting. But you need to know, your father and I have changed our will. Everything we have will go to Thomas, your son, the one you abandoned." Jake's sobs turned to shouts. "No. You can't do that. I'll go back to Sarah, we can start over." "Goodbye, Jake," I said firmly, and ended the call. Tom found me on the porch swing a little while later, staring out at the setting sun. He sat beside me, taking my hand in his. "You okay?" he asked gently. I nodded, squeezing his hand. "I am. It's not the ending I would have chosen for us, but I think we're exactly where we're meant to be." And we were. Our new life, though different from what we'd imagined, was filled with purpose and love. Every weekend, our home was filled with the joyous sounds of Thomas's laughter as he explored every nook and cranny. Sarah, once just our son's girlfriend, had become the daughter we never had. "Grandma, Grandpa." Thomas's little voice called out one Sunday afternoon. "Look what I can do." We watched in delight as he took his first wobbly steps across the living room, collapsing into Sarah's waiting arms. Sarah looked up at us, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "I don't know what I would have done without you two," she said softly. "You've been more like parents to me than I ever expected to have." I knelt down beside her, wrapping them both in a hug. "Oh, sweetheart. You and Thomas, you're our family. We couldn't love you more if we tried." As I looked around at the faces of my family, Tom's weathered smile, Sarah's gentle eyes, Thomas's chubby cheeks, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. This was not the life I had planned, but it was a life filled with more love, more joy, and more purpose than I could have ever imagined.